is a valley that does not appear on any map she has ever unfolded. And yet, Sable Morrow has the feeling, standing at its edge in the slow grey dusk, that she has always known it was here. If this story finds you well tonight, there are more worlds waiting for you on this channel. Simply subscribe, and a new door will open for you each week. The road that brought her here was a narrow one, the kind that follows the curve of the land rather than cutting through it. It wound between low hills covered in silver-green moss, past a stream that moved so quietly she had almost missed the sound of it entirely. The light had been fading for some time now, not abruptly, the way it did in cities, where one moment the sky was gold and the next it was simply dark, but gently, as though the day were easing itself out of the air, the way warmth eases out of a cup of tea. She had not planned to travel tonight. She had not planned much of anything, which was perhaps how she had come to be here at all. Standing at the top of a hillside path, with a small canvas bag slung over one shoulder, looking down into a valley where a single building held light in every window. It was an inn. She knew it without being told. The shape of it was immediately legible to her. The wide, low roofline, the generous chimney leaking one thin thread of smoke into the cooling air, the warm amber squares of window light staggered across the stone face of the building. It sat at the far end of a lane, bordered on both sides by tall hedgerows, their tops softened by the evening into dark, rounded shapes that made the lane feel like a passage between two gentle arms. She began walking toward it. The path was made of old cobblestones rounded by years of rain, and her footsteps were quieter than she expected. The hedgerows on either side released a faint green smell as she passed, something clean and slightly sweet, the way a garden smells just before the dew settles. Above her, the first stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue cloth of the sky, not all at once, but one by one, tentatively, as though each one were testing whether it was safe to show itself. As she drew closer to the inn, she could make out the details of it more clearly. The stonework was old but well kept, modded neatly and draped in places with a vine, whose leaves had gone a deep, burnished copper in the cooling season. The door at the front was wooden, broad, and painted in a shade of green that had faded pleasantly toward grey. Above it, suspended on a simple iron bracket, a lantern burned with a steady amber flame that did not waver even when the evening breeze moved through the lane. Beside the lantern, carved directly into the lintel stone, were 2 words, Ashenford Inn. She paused a moment and read them, and something in her chest settled quietly, the way a bird settles onto a branch it has decided to trust. She pushed the door open. The warmth of the interior met her before she had taken a single step inside. It was the warmth of a fire that had been burning for hours, deep and even and generous, the kind that makes your shoulders drop the moment you feel it. The room before her was low-ceilinged and wide, with heavy wooden beams overhead and flagstone floors beneath her feet. There were tables, each one lit by a small candle set in a clay dish. There were chairs positioned invitingly near the fire. There were shelves along one wall, filled not with bottles, but with objects she could not quite make out from the doorway, small shapes, rounded and various, arranged with care. The room was empty of other guests. And then she saw him. He was standing near the far wall, attending to a candle on one of the high shelves. He was unhurried in the way that people are when they have never once in their lives felt the pressure of a clock. He was tall, but not imposing, with the kind of presence that does not announce itself, but simply is steady, warm, already familiar in the way that a well-known room is familiar, even the first time you enter it. He wore a simple linen apron over dark clothes, and his hands, as they moved to trim the candle's wick with a small pair of brass scissors, were careful and deliberate. When he had finished, he set the scissors down on the shelf with a soft click and turned toward her without surprise, as though he had known she was there, had perhaps known she was coming. His face was not young and not old. It was a quiet face, the kind that has passed through many seasons without hardening against any of them. He said simply, "Good evening." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not carry farther than it needs to. Sable, who had not spoken to anyone in several days, found that she did not immediately know what to say. But she did not feel awkward about this. The room did not require anything from her. Neither did he. "Good evening," she said at last. He moved toward a small table near the fire, unhurried, and pulled a chair out with one hand. "You'll want to sit," he said. It was not a question, and it was not a command. It was simply an observation offered gently, the way one might remark that the rain had finally stopped. She crossed the flagstone floor and sat. He moved away toward what she assumed was the kitchen, and the fire settled in the grate with a low, satisfied sound. And somewhere deep in the building, a candle flame stretched and bowed and righted itself. She did not yet know this man's name, or the name of the valley, or what had truly drawn her down that winding road. But those questions, for the first time in a long while, did not feel urgent. She held her hands out toward the fire, and the warmth reached them slowly, and that was enough. Somewhere in the walls of the inn, a soft sound moved, not quite music, not quite silence, as though the building itself had taken a long, contented breath. His name was Corin. She learned this not because he introduced himself formally. He did not seem to be the kind of man who offered his name the way others do, as a transaction, a small key traded for another, but because she heard him murmur it to himself as he came back from the kitchen, carrying a small tray with a bowl of something warm and a cup of something darker and more fragrant. He had said it the way a person says their own name when they are alone, quietly, as though just confirming they are still there. He set the tray before her and retreated a single step, folding his hands in front of him. "Broth," he said, "of the bowl, and the cup is honeyed barley. It goes cool quickly, so it's best taken soon." He said this without looking at her directly, in the manner of someone who understands that direct attention can sometimes feel like pressure, and that some people, on some evenings, need simply to be near another person without being watched. She appreciated this, though she did not say so. The broth was simple, clean, and golden, with a faint herbal note she could not identify, something between thyme and something older, something that tasted like a kitchen that had been cooking for 100 years. She wrapped both hands around the bowl and let the warmth move up through her palms before she took the first sip. Corin had returned to his work. He was moving along the far wall now, the brass scissors still in one hand, attending to the candles one by one. This seemed to be a ritual of his, she would come to understand this in the days ahead, not merely practical, not merely maintenance. He tended each candle the way a gardener tends each plant, with specific, quiet attention, as though each one were individual, each one mattered. The action, she noticed, was always the same. He would pause before a candle. He would look at the flame for a moment without expression. Then he would reach up with the scissors and make the smallest adjustment to the wick. Then he would step back, look again, and move on. Trim, observe, move on. It was extraordinarily calming to watch. The fire in the grate had settled into a steady burn, and the light in the room had taken on a quality that was difficult to name. It was not simply warm, but layered, built from many small sauces, each candle adding its own small contribution to the whole, so that the overall effect was of depth rather than brightness. Amber gathered upon amber, shadow given texture by light. Outside the windows, the evening had completed its work. It was full night now, and the glass of the nearest window showed her the valley in darkness. The far hills a blurred suggestion, the sky above them strangely bright despite its darkness, thick with stars that reflected off what she could now see was a body of water, a lake, or something very like one, lying still and silver in the distance. She had not noticed the lake on her way down the path. She thought she should have. She did not dwell on this. When she had finished the broth and most of the barley, she felt a heaviness in her limbs that was not unpleasant, not the heaviness of illness or grief, but the good, clean weight of a body that has finally been allowed to stop. She had been in motion for a long time, not always physically, but in the way of a mind that could not settle. A person who had been trying to solve something without knowing what the problem was. Here, there did not appear to be any problem. Corin came past her table with a new candle, a fresh one, cream-colored, slightly wider than the others, and set it in the clay dish at the center of her table, replacing the older one, which had burned low. He lit the new candle with a taper he carried in his other hand, and then he stood for a moment and regarded the flame in his usual way. "You'll take the room at the top of the east staircase," he said, not unkindly. It was the same quality of statement as before, offered rather than directed, a certainty extended as a courtesy. "Thank you," she said, He looked at her then, briefly, a quiet and unhurried look. His eyes were the color of deep water, not blue exactly, more the shade of the sky just before the last light leaves it. There was a great deal of patience in his face, the kind that does not come from waiting, but from having genuinely stopped wanting things to be different than they are. "The stairs creak on the third step," he said. "There's no help for it. The building was already old when I came to it." She wanted to ask him how long ago that had been, but she found she wasn't sure she needed the answer. The question felt like the wrong shape for this room. "I'll remember," she said. He nodded once and moved away, trimming another wick, the small click of the scissors soft and regular as a clock that was ticking out a very different kind of time than clocks usually keep. She sat a while longer. The fire spoke to itself in low, comfortable tones. The candle at her table burned straight and still. Above her, the beams of the ceiling held the darkness between them like something being kept safe. When she finally rose to find the east staircase, she felt lighter than she had in months. Not because anything had changed, not because she had resolved anything or arrived anywhere particular, but simply because, for the first time in a long time, she was entirely present in the room she was standing in. She paused at the foot of the stairs and looked back once at Corin's moving silhouette against the candlelit wall. She did not yet know what was kept in the locked room at the end of the upstairs hall, behind the door with no handle, only a small hook, and on the hook an unlit candle tied with a strand of silver thread. The room at the top of the east staircase was small, and it was exactly right. The bed was wooden framed, with a headboard worn smooth by years of someone's hands, and the mattress was covered in a quilt of cream and faded amber squares that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft as breath. There was a window above the narrow writing desk, and through it Sable could see the lake she had noticed from downstairs. It lay in the valley below like a piece of fallen sky, perfectly still, holding the reflection of stars with perfect patience. A candle burned on the desk. It had been lit before she arrived. She stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at the room, not inspecting it, but receiving it way you receive a piece of news that surprises you, not because it is unexpected, but because it is better than you had allowed yourself to hope. She set her bag on the chair by the desk and sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was cool at first, and then warm where her hands rested on it. She could hear faintly the sound of the fire downstairs. Or perhaps it was the sound of the building itself, which had a particular quality of warmth that felt as though it came not from any single source, but from the accumulated heat of every season it had passed through, stored in its stone and its wood, and let back out slowly into the night. She had not brought much with her. A change of clothes, a small notebook she had not written in for months, a folded photograph she kept in the front pocket of the bag, but had not looked at in longer than she could say with precision. These were the things she traveled with, not because they were all she owned, but because they were the things that, on the evening she had packed the bag, had seemed most necessary to keep close. She brushed her hair and changed into the clean shirt she had packed and sat at the desk. The candle moved slightly, drawing its light across the surface of the notebook. She opened it to a blank page and looked at it for a long time without writing anything. This did not feel like failure. It felt more like standing at the edge of a pool and deciding that you did not need to swim tonight, that it was enough to simply stand at the edge and feel the coolness of the water against your feet. She closed the notebook. Outside, the night had deepened into the particular shaded reaches when it is well past midnight, and the world has gone fully inward. No movement in the trees, no light in any other window, just the silver lake holding its stars, and the occasional small sound of the building adjusting itself in the cool air. Wood contracting softly. A door somewhere below settling in its frame. She thought about Corin, moving through the inn with his scissors and his taper. She wondered how long he had been at this, the tending, the lighting, the trimming. There was something in the way he moved that suggested he had been doing it for a very long time, not because he was tired, but because the repetition had become a kind of peace, a daily renewal of something he valued. She found she envied it, mildly and without bitterness. She had not had a ritual for a long time. She had not had a place that expected certain things of her, not in a demanding way, but in the way a garden expects to be walked through in the morning, or a cat expects its particular spot by the fire. Those small expected pleasures, she had let most of them go, and she had not noticed the going until now, looking at their absence from a quiet room in an inn that smelled of beeswax and aged wood and something faintly floral she could not name. She blew out the candle. In the darkness, the window was even more vivid than before, the lake below catching the moonlight that had risen while she sat at the desk, full and low in the sky, the kind of moon that makes shadows long and everything it touches look gently illuminated from within. The hills on the far side of the valley were visible in its light, soft and rounded, and she lay back on the pillow and watched the sky through the window with her eyes half open. She had not watched the sky in a very long time. She had looked at it, of course. You could not walk through the world without occasionally noting its presence overhead. But watching it was different. Watching required stillness, and stillness required permission. And permission was something she had forgotten she could give to herself. The moon moved almost imperceptibly in its slow arc. A single cloud passed across it and away, thin and pale as gauze, and the light in the room shifted slightly as it went. She thought she should not be able to sleep easily in a strange room, in a strange valley, in an inn whose keeper she had met only this evening. But her eyes were already heavy, and the bed was holding her exactly as a bed should, completely, without question, as though the weight of her was the most natural thing in the world to carry. She did not try to stay awake. She simply released the effort, and rest came to meet her, unhurried as Corin's hands, as steady as the candles he kept lit through every hour of the night. The last thing she was aware of was the sound of something downstairs, a soft, low note, not quite a melody, not quite a voice, as though the inn itself were humming just below the level of hearing, and she sank into sleep on the quiet surface of it. She had not noticed, as she fell asleep, the faint shimmer at the edge of the lake, a bluish light that had not been there when she first looked out, gentle and still, rising and falling like something breathing. The room at the top of the east staircase was small, and it was exactly right. The bed was wooden framed, with a headboard worn smooth by years of someone's hands, and the mattress was covered in a quilt of cream and faded amber squares that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft as breath. There was a window above the narrow writing desk, and through it Sable could see the lake she had noticed from downstairs. It lay in the valley below like a piece of fallen sky, perfectly still, holding the reflection of stars with perfect patience. A candle burned on the desk. It had been lit before she arrived. She stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at the room, not inspecting it, but receiving it, the way you receive a piece of news that surprises you, not because it is unexpected, but because it is better than you had allowed yourself to hope. She set her bag on the chair by the desk and sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt was cool at first, and then warm where her hands rested on it. She could hear faintly the sound of the fire downstairs. Or perhaps it was the sound of the building itself, which had a particular quality of warmth that felt as though it came not from any single source, but from the accumulated heat of every season it had passed through, stored in its stone and its wood, and let back out slowly into the night. She had not brought much with her. A change of clothes, a small notebook she had not written in for months, a folded photograph she kept in the front pocket of the bag, but had not looked at in longer than she could say with precision. These were the things she traveled with, not because they were all she owned, but because they were the things that, on the evening she had packed the bag, had seemed most necessary to keep close. She brushed her hair and changed into the clean shirt she had packed and sat at the desk. The candle moved slightly, drawing its light across the surface of the notebook. She opened it to a blank page and looked at it for a long time without writing anything. This did not feel like failure. It felt more like standing at the edge of a pool and deciding that you did not need to swim tonight, that it was enough to simply stand at the edge and feel the coolness of the water against your feet. She closed the notebook. Outside, the night had deepened into the particular shaded reaches when it is well past midnight, and the world has gone fully inward. movement in the trees, no light in any other window, just the silver lake holding its stars, and the occasional small sound of the building adjusting itself in the cool air. Wood contracting softly. A daw somewhere below settling in its frame. She thought about Corin, moving through the inn with his scissors and his taper. She wondered how long he had been at this, the tending, the lighting, the trimming. There was something in the way he moved that suggested he had been doing it for a very long time, not because he was tired, but because the repetition had become a kind of peace, a daily renewal of something he valued. She found she envied it, mildly and without bitterness. She had not had a ritual for a long time. She had not had a place that expected certain things of her, not in a demanding way, but in the way a garden expects to be walked through in the morning, or a cat expects its particular spot by the fire. Those small expected pleasures. She had let most of them go, and she had not noticed the going until now, looking at their absence from a quiet room in an inn that smelled of beeswax and aged wood, and something faintly floral she could not name. She blew out the candle. In the darkness, the window was even more vivid than before, the lake below catching the moonlight that had risen while she sat at the desk, full and low in the sky, the kind of moon that makes shadows long and everything it touches look gently illuminated from within. The hills on the far side of the valley were visible in its light, soft and rounded, and she lay back on the pillow and watched the sky through the window with her eyes half open. She had not watched the sky in a very long time. She had looked at it, of course. You could not walk through the world without occasionally noting its presence overhead. But watching it was different. Watching required stillness, and stillness required permission. And permission was something she had forgotten she could give to herself. The moon moved, almost imperceptibly, in its slow arc. A single cloud passed across it and away, thin and pale as gauze, and the light in the room shifted slightly as it went. She thought she should not be able to sleep easily in a strange room, in a strange valley, in an inn whose keeper she had met only this evening. But her eyes were already heavy, and the bed was holding her exactly as a bed should, completely, without question, as though the weight of her was the most natural thing in the world to carry. she did not try to stay awake. She simply released the effort, and rest came to meet her, unhurried as Corin's hands, as steady as the candles he kept lit through every hour of the night. The last thing she was aware of was the sound of something downstairs, a soft, low note, not quite a melody, not quite a voice, as though the inn itself were humming just below the level of hearing, and she sank into sleep on the quiet surface of it. She had not noticed, as she fell asleep, the faint shimmer at the edge of the lake, a bluish light that had not been there when she first looked out, gentle and still, rising and falling like something breathing. After breakfast, she walked. She had not planned to. She had been sitting at the table with her empty bowl, watching the mist on the lake, when the door to the outside had simply seemed to ask something of her. Not a demand, not an invitation with expectation attached to it, just a quiet suggestion, the kind that sometimes arises from the body rather than the mind, a peripheral leaning toward the door, toward the morning air, toward whatever the valley looked like at eye level. She took her coat from the hook near the entrance and went out. The cobblestone lane was wet with overnight dew, each stone holding a small silver disk of moisture on its rounded top. Her footsteps were soft on them. The hedgerows on either side were head high and dense, their leaves still carrying the night's dampness, and when she brushed one gently with her fingers as she walked, the water transferred to her hand in cold droplets that she did not bother to wipe away. The lane curved to the right past the inn, and then ran straight for a time before splitting. She took the lower fork, which led, she thought, based on her view from the window, toward the lake. She was right. After perhaps 10 minutes of walking, the lane ended at a low stone wall, and beyond the wall, the ground sloped gently down to the water. The lake was larger than it had appeared from above, and up close it had a different quality. Not the still mirror it became at night, but a living surface, moving with the wind in small, light ripples that caught the morning sun and turned it briefly into something scattered and bright. The far shore was a soft green, lined with trees she could not name from this distance, their shapes rounded and quiet. She sat on the wall. The wind off the water was cool, but not cold, carried the smell of the lake, something clean and slightly green, the smell of water that has been in the same valley for a very long time and is entirely comfortable with that fact. A bird called from somewhere in the reeds to her left, a single repeated note, patient and unhurried. She sat for a long time. There was nothing she needed to think about. This was still unusual enough that it surprised her slightly. Not that the thoughts were absent, but that their absence didn't trouble her. In ordinary life, there were always things to occupy the mind's worried fingers, small undone tasks, ambiguous conversations replaying themselves, questions without answers, the low persistent hum of not being quite where you thought you should be by now. But sitting on the wall by the lake in the valley of Ashenford, none of that seemed reachable. It was as if the place itself had a low ceiling that thoughts of a certain agitation simply could not pass through. She breathed. The water moved. On the walk back, she passed a part of the grounds she had not noticed on the way out. A section of the inn's exterior she had not seen from the lane. It was on the north face of the building, away from the road, and it had the quality of a space that had grown into itself over many years without human interference. A sprawl of climbing vines covering the stonework to the height of the first floor windows, their leaves gone copper and deep green in layers, and tucked into the angle where the north wall met a low outbuilding, a garden of sorts, or what had once been a garden and had gently relaxed into something wilder. There were plants she did not know, low-growing things with silver-gray leaves, and taller ones with dry seed heads rattling faintly in the wind. And in the corner, half hidden by the outbuilding wall, a rose bush that had gone leggy and unpruned, but was still, despite everything, producing one late flower, a small, deep pink thing, nearly burgundy, opening toward whatever warmth it could find. She stopped and looked at it. It seemed important in a way she could not articulate, not symbolic, not meaningful in any constructed sense, but simply present in the way that things that have survived without being tended sometimes are quietly extraordinary, quietly permanent. She went inside. Corin was in the main room at the shelves, trimming a wick. He did not look up as she entered, but she had come to understand that this was not inattention. He was simply a person who processed each thing fully before moving to the next. And just now, the candle required him entirely. She sat by the fire. After a while, he came and sat in the other chair, the one across from hers, which she had not seen him use before. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the fire the way he looked at candles, with that steady and patient attention. "You found the garden," he said. "Is it a garden?" she asked. "It was," he said, "and it still is in its way. Things grow there that I didn't plant." A silence sat between them, comfortable as the warmth. "There's a late rose," she said, "on the north side." He nodded once slowly. "She comes back every year," he said. "Later than she should, and more persistent than you'd expect." He said this with a quiet affection, the way one speaks of an old friend who has an inconvenient but beloved habit. She thought about this for a while. Then she thought about the flower itself, the way it had been turning toward a warmth that wasn't quite enough, and still opening anyway. She did not feel like crying, but she felt the possibility of it very close, not as grief, but as release, as the way you feel when something you had been carrying has been set down, and you realize, only after the fact, how heavy it was. She stayed by the fire until the light outside had moved through the full arc of the afternoon. She did not yet know that tomorrow Corin would bring her, without explanation, a small clay dish containing a circle of dried herbs and a candle of deep, dusty gold, unlit, and set it on the table before her with a quiet ceremony she would feel but not quite understand. The next morning brought rain. She heard it before she opened her eyes, a soft, steady percussion on the window glass, the sound of it arriving from across the valley in waves, lightening and deepening as the wind shifted. It was not the urgent kind of rain. It was the slow, settled kind that has made up its mind to stay for a while and is not troubled by this decision. She lay in bed and listened to it. There is a particular comfort in being inside during rain that is separate from the comfort of being simply warm. It is a comfort made of contrast, the water and the cold outside, the dryness and the warmth within, and it satisfies something in the body that fair weather, however pleasant, does not quite reach. She had always loved rainy mornings, she had lost track of this somewhere in the years of having to be somewhere, do something, resolve something before the day had properly started. She remembered it now. Downstairs, the fire was already at its fullest. Corin had been up before she had. She understood, because the fire was never rebuilt from scratch while she watched, but was always already burning when she came down, always already past its first reluctant stage and settled into its generous middle period. She had begun to wonder whether he slept at all. He brought her tea this morning, a deep amber liquid in a wide, low cup, very hot, carrying the taste of something floral and slightly earthy. She wrapped her hands around the cup and sat near the window, watching the rain arrive in long, slanted lines across the surface of the lake. The rain animated the valley in a way that clear weather did not. Without it, the landscape was beautiful in the way of a painting, still, composed, everything in its place. In the rain, it was alive. The surface of the lake was stippled in 1,000 places at once, constantly renewed, a pattern that was never the same twice, but was always recognizably itself. The hills above had disappeared into low cloud, and the cloud moved slowly, thinning and thickening as it passed. She had brought her notebook down and set it on the table, and at some point, she was not sure exactly when she found that she had opened it and was writing. Not anything she had planned to write, not the tidy, purposeful writing she had once been good at, the organized and self-editing kind. She was simply writing what she saw: the rain, the cup, the way the candle on her table threw the shadow of the cup's handle in a long arc across the tablecloth. The sound of Corin in the kitchen, slow and methodical. The quality of the light when the cloud thinned for a moment and the lake's surface brightened before dimming again. It was writing of the smallest possible ambition, and she found it was the most honest thing she had written in years. Around mid-morning, Corin appeared from the kitchen and set something on the table beside her notebook without remark, a small clay dish, and in the dish, a circle of dried herbs arranged in a ring, and in the center of the ring, a candle. The candle was the same deep, dusty gold as the one she had noticed on the high shelf, and like that one, its wick was still white, still unlit. She looked at it, then at him. He had his usual expression, everything in it has been put in the right place. "What is this?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously, turning it over for a moment before answering. "Something for when you're ready," he said. He set the brass scissors on the table beside the dish. The scissors she had seen him use every evening on the inn's candles. And then he folded his hands and tilted his head slightly to one side. That small tilt was his gesture, the one she had begun to look for without knowing it. A slight incline of the head that meant he was about to say something that mattered. "Every guest brings something with them," he said. "Most of them don't know what it is when they arrive. Some of them never know, and that's all right too. But sometimes, not always, just sometimes, by the time they're ready to leave, they can say what it was they were carrying." She looked at the unlit candle. "And the candle?" she asked. "When you light it," he said, "you'll know why." He left it at that. He returned to the kitchen, and the sound of the rain against the windows continued its soft, percussive report, and the fire spoke to itself in low and satisfied tones. She sat with the dish between her hands and looked at the unlit candle for a long time. She thought about what she had been carrying. She tried to give it a shape, a name, the way you try to identify something in low light, not staring at it directly, because that made it disappear, but looking slightly to one side, letting it appear in the edge of vision. It was something like tiredness, but tiredness was not quite right. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from spending a long time being something other than yourself, not lying exactly, not performing, but simply being a slightly different shape than the one that was native to you, for so long that you had stopped being sure what the original shape was. She had come to Ashenford in not knowing she was looking for that shape, but she was beginning to think it was here somewhere, in the sound of the rain, in the writing she had done without trying, in the late rose on the north wall, in the particular quality of warmth that Corin's fire always gave and never withheld. The candle was still unlit when she finally went up to dress for the afternoon, but she was no longer uncertain that she would light it, and she would come to understand that for now, that was enough, and that when she next came to sit by the fire, there would be a small key on the table beside the clay dish, warm as though it had been held in someone's hand. The key was there the next morning. She had come downstairs expecting it, in a dim and wordless way, the way you sometimes expect a kindness before it arrives, not quite foreseeing it, but leaving a space in your attention where it might land. And it had landed. A small brass key, warm-toned and simply made, laid on the edge of the table beside the clay dish with the unlit gold candle. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the key and the candle, and the rain still coming down outside in its soft and settled way. She picked up the key and held it. It fit her palm exactly, small and smooth, without ornamentation, the kind of key that belongs to something modest and interior. A drawer, perhaps, or a box, or a room not much larger than a thought. She set it back down, drank her tea, and waited for Corin. He came from the kitchen in his usual way, unhurried, with the linen apron, carrying 2 cups this time, which he set on the table before taking the chair across from her. This was becoming a habit of the mornings. Tea together in the quiet before the day had decided what it was going to be. He looked at the key without looking at it, in the way that people who are practiced at not making things into events allow their gaze to pass over what is significant without stopping there. "There's a corridor behind the kitchen," he said, "that I've been meaning to show you." "I wondered," she said. He looked up at her then, that small tilt of the head, and something in the quality of his expression shifted slightly, not toward surprise, but toward a kind of recognition, as though she had said the correct thing without knowing what the correct thing was. They took their tea and went. The corridor behind the kitchen was low-ceilinged and long, running along the back of the inn parallel to the main room. The walls were stone, and the floor was a mix of the same flagstone as the main room, and in places, worn wooden boards that had been fitted around older stone where the original floor had lifted over the years. Corin carried a taper, though the corridor was not entirely dark. At regular intervals, small candles in iron sconces burned with steady, untroubled flames. The smell back here was different from the main room. More beeswax, less fire smoke, and beneath both a deeper note of aged stone and the faint greenish smell of plants growing somewhere nearby. "The storerooms are along the left," Corin said as they passed a series of closed doors. Herbs, wax, linen, the things the inn needs, she nodded. The corridor curved slightly and widened, and the ceiling rose, and then she understood the green smell. On the right side, a door stood open onto what she could only describe as a growing room. A low ceilinged space with deep stone shelves running along all four walls, each shelf containing clay pots, each pot containing a plant. The plants were at various stages of growth, various heights and shapes, and the whole room had the thick, warm air of a place where things are being carefully tended toward their best selves. She stopped in the doorway. "You grow things," she said. "Most of what goes into the broth," he said, "and the herbs in the dish." He gestured with the taper toward a shelf near the door, and she could see there the same grey-leafed, silver plants she had seen in the wild garden on the north face. Except here they were smaller and clearly cultivated, each plant precisely spaced, each pot labeled in his compact notation. She walked between the shelves slowly. The light in the room was warm despite the absence of windows. The candles and the growing things together, producing something that felt almost like sunlight, not its brightness, but its quality of encouragement. Near the back of the room, on a shelf lower than the others, was a pot she noticed because it was different from its neighbors. Older, chipped at the rim, filled with a dark soil that looked recently worked. No plant was visible yet, just soil, and on the surface of the soil, very small and just legible, a mark made in Corin's notation. The same circle with a line through it that she had seen on the tag of the tall gold candle. She looked at it for a long moment. "Empty," she said, not quite asking. "Not empty," he said from the doorway. "Waiting." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with the taper, and the light of the growing room caught the planes of his face and made him look, for a moment, very old, not aged, not diminished, but old in the way of a tree or a stone, old in the way of something that has been exactly itself for a very long time and sees no reason to change. "What's it waiting for?" she asked. He looked at the empty pot, the slight tilt of his head. Then the right season, he said simply. And he said it the way he said everything, without insistence, without mystery making, as though it were the most natural and obvious thing in the world. She stayed in the growing room after he had gone back to the kitchen, moving slowly among the shelves, looking at each plant. She learned nothing in any direct way, but she carried something out of the room when she left, a sense of having been shown something that mattered, a feeling like the early stage of understanding before the words for it have arrived. She walked back through the corridor alone, past the iron sconces and their steady little flames, and at the corner where the corridor widened she stopped, because she could hear, very faintly, from somewhere ahead of her and to the left, the quiet sound of a door that had not been closed all the way, opening slowly by itself on its old and patient hinges. She stood in the corridor and listened. The sound did not repeat. The door, wherever it was, had opened, and now the corridor was holding its breath, and she was holding hers, and the candles in their sconces burned in perfect stillness, as though even the air had paused to see what she would do. She walked forward. The corridor curved again, more sharply this time, and she came to a junction she had not noticed on the way in, a small widening in the stone passage, where a narrow staircase descended to the left, and a door stood open on the right. The door was low-arched and wooden, older than any other door she had seen in the inn, its surface darkened to the color of a deep forest at night, and worn smooth at the edges. Beyond it was a room. She did not cross the threshold immediately. She stood in the doorway and looked. The room was small. Its walls were stone like the corridor, and the ceiling was low, and everything in it was the cool, slightly damp gray of an interior that receives little heat and no direct light. But in the center of the room, on a simple wooden table, there was something that did not belong to the gray. It was a lantern, not like the lantern above the inn's front door, not a practical, working lantern, but an old one, very old, made of something that might once have been iron, but had been transformed over time into a surface of deep, pocked green-black, and through its four-paned sides a light burned, not a candle inside, was not quite. The flame was the wrong color, a warm gold threaded through with a trace of something paler and cooler, and it did not flicker as candles flicker. It breathed. She stood in the doorway for a very long time. The light from the lantern reached across the small room in a slow, even way that made everything it touched look considered, important, the particular grain of the table's wood, the place where the stone floor had been worn slightly smooth by years of feet, the curved underside of the arch above the door. It was illuminating not brightness, but detail. She crossed the threshold. Up close, the lantern was smaller than it had appeared from the doorway. No taller than her forearm stood on end. She did not touch it. She simply sat on the low stool that stood beside the table. There was a stool. She had not noticed it until she was close and looked at the flame. The flame breathed in and out with a rhythm she recognized without being able to name. The same rhythm as sleep, as the long, slow oscillation of a body at rest, the tide-like movement of a person who has let go of the day's intentions and given itself over to the simple work of being alive. She breathed with it. She did not do this deliberately. It happened the way things happen in certain rooms, without being decided, without effort, just a slow realigning of the body's internal rhythm with the rhythm of the space it had entered. Her shoulders descended. Her hands, which she had not known were gathered, opened in her lap. Her breath, which she had not known was shallow, deepened without her asking it to. She stayed in the small room with the lantern for a long time. When she finally became aware of Corin's presence, he was standing in the doorway without having announced himself, as was his habit. He was looking at the lantern with the same attention he gave his candles, the same patient, non-possessive regard. "How long has it been here?" she asked, her voice lower than usual, suited to the room. "Since before I came," he said. She thought about this. "And does it ever go out?" He looked at the flame with its slow breathing. "I've never known it to," he said. "But I've wondered. Doesn't it worry you, the slight tilt?" "No," he said. "Something that has never gone out has earned a certain trust." She nodded. The flame breathed. She thought of all the things she had tended and let go out, not through neglect exactly, but through the accumulation of other priorities, other urgencies, the slow substitution of the important by the pressing. She had let several small fires go out in herself over the years. She had noticed each going at the time and told herself she would relight them when she had more time, more energy, more of whatever resource it was she had run short of. She had not relighted them. Looking at the lantern, she found she did not feel guilty about this. She felt, instead, a kind of useful sorrow, the kind that is not paralysis, but information, that tells you not what you have lost, but what you still want, and in wanting, reveals that it is still possible. There were things in her that had not gone out. She was fairly certain. She was less certain what they were, but she was beginning to believe that this inn, this corridor, this room, this old lantern with its patient flame was offering her some kind of slow inventory. She was not ready to name anything yet, but she was ready, she thought, to keep looking. When she rose to leave, the lantern's light stretched her shadow long across the stone floor, and she paused for a moment in the doorway and turned back to look at it once more. The flame was still breathing, steady and gold, and the room was still holding its cool gray quiet. And she understood, as she turned away, that she could come back here whenever she needed to, that the room did not lock, that the lantern would be burning, and that whatever it was she was slowly finding her way toward, this small stone room was part of the path. She would discover in the morning that her notebook had filled 7 pages in the night, in her own hand, with words she had not known she was ready to write. She read what she had written before coming downstairs. She had not remembered writing it. She had gone to sleep with an empty mind, or what had felt like an empty mind, which she was beginning to understand was perhaps just a full mind that had finally found a way to become quiet. And she had woken to the notebook open on the desk, and the pages covered in her handwriting, small and steady, and so close together that she must have written without pause. She sat at the desk and read. It was not a journal entry, not a letter, not a story. It was something in between all of those things, fragments of observation and fragments of memory pressed up against each other like specimens in a collection, each one whole in itself, none of them reaching toward explanation. The rain on the lake, the clay dish, her mother's hands making bread on a Sunday when Sable was very young, the late rose, corridors smell of beeswax, the way Corin held his brass scissors, gently as though they were important, the lanterns breathing flame, the feeling which she had written down in plain, unadorned language that she had been away from herself for a long time, and that she was only now beginning slowly to walk back. She read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window. The sky was clear this morning, sharply blue, and the lake below was the same blue as the sky, mirrored and deepened, and the mist that had lingered in the valley for the past several days had lifted overnight. She could see the far hills now with their rounded, tree-covered slopes, and between the hills and the inn's grounds, the meadow. She had not seen the meadow from this angle before. A long, pale gold stretch of grass, still carrying the shapes of the previous night's wind. She went downstairs. Corin was at the shelves. He had been at the shelves, she thought, every morning since she arrived. She had begun to understand that this was not business. This was care, the specific, daily, repeated practice of attention that keeps a thing alive. He was not checking the candles. He was tending them. There was a difference, and she was beginning to feel the difference in her own body. The way you feel the difference between performing a task and genuinely attending to it. She sat at the table, and he brought tea without being asked, and they sat for a while in the morning quiet. "I wrote last night," she said eventually. He looked at the fire. "I know," he said. The candle burned through the night. She thought of the candle corresponding to her room on the shelf, the small cream one, the only one burning the first evening she arrived. She had not thought about what it meant that it was burning while she slept, while she wrote, while she turned slowly like something finding its orientation. "Does it matter," she asked, "what I wrote?" Corin held his tea with both hands, the way she had learned to hold things since arriving in this place fully, with intention, giving the act the weight it deserved. "It matters that you wrote it," he said. "Not what it was." She nodded. After tea, she walked out into the meadow she had seen from her window. It was a longer walk than it looked. The meadow was farther from the inn than the window had suggested, separated from the grounds by a low wooden fence, and then a stretch of shorter, wilder grass, and she had to climb the fence carefully before she was properly in it. The grass in the meadow was long and dry, and the color of very old parchment, and it moved in the morning wind with a sound like soft paper, a cool rustling that was nothing like the rain, but was as continuous as the rain had been, and just as steady. She walked through it slowly, the grass reaching her waist in places, and she turned and looked back at the inn. From here, it was a complete picture. The stone building with its warm windows, even in daylight they held a warmth, and the hedgerows and the lane, and above it all the chimney's quiet thread of smoke. She could see the north face from this angle, and the vine covering it, and the small dark shape in the angle of the outbuilding wall, where she knew the late rose was still opening toward whatever warmth it could find. She stood in the meadow for a long time. She thought about what she was returning to. Not today. There was no today in Ashenford, she felt. There was only the accumulated ease of the present, but eventually, there would be an eventually. Ashenford was not a place you stayed forever. It was a place you came to and were changed by, and carried with you when you left. She was beginning to know what she would carry, not answers. She had not found answers, but she had found the beginnings of better questions, quieter ones, less afraid of their own conclusions, more willing to wait for understanding than to force it into premature shape. She would carry the lantern's breath, the late rose, the feel of the brass key in her palm, smooth and warm and modest in its ambition. The sight of Corin's hands with the scissors, giving each small flame exactly what it needed and nothing more. She would carry the knowledge that she had written 7 pages in the night, and that the writing had come not from effort, but from stillness, and that stillness was not the opposite of her, as she had sometimes feared, but was the place she came from. She turned and walked back through the meadow toward the inn, and the grass moved around her as she went, and the smoke from the chimney rose in its calm, patient line, and the windows held their amber warmth, and she was glad, without reservation, to be walking back. She would find, when she arrived at the inn's front door, that the unlit gold candle in the clay dish had been moved to her table by the fire, and beside it the brass scissors, set down with care. She sat before the gold candle for a long time that afternoon. She did not light it. She sat with it in the way that Corin sat with his candles before he tended them, with attention, with a quality of presence that did not reach toward the thing or demand anything of it. She had borrowed this quality from watching him, practicing it without meaning to. The way you sometimes absorb a way of moving from a person you have spent time with. The fire was at its usual steady burn. The rain had returned softer than before, a mist rain that blurred the window glass and made the world outside look like something seen through muslin. Inside, the inn was warm and dense with familiar smells. The beeswax, the herbs from dinner, the faint wood smoke, and something underneath all of those that she had begun to think of as the smell of the building itself, stone and time, and the accumulated warmth of many years. Corin came and sat across from her in his chair. They sat together without speaking, looking at the candle between them. "You'll know when," he said eventually. He did not look at her when he said it. He was looking at the gold candle with the quality of attention he gave to everything, the slight forward stillness of someone who is genuinely listening. She had been thinking about when. She had been thinking, in fact, about the shape of the thing she had been carrying. The one he had mentioned on the second day. The thing every guest brings without knowing it. She had turned it in her mind many times since then, approaching it from different angles, the way you approach a word you almost know. Certain the meaning is there, waiting for the moment when the right angle reveals it. She thought it was this. She had spent a long time being useful. This was not a complaint. Usefulness was something she valued, something she genuinely wanted to offer to the world and to the people she loved. But somewhere in the practice of being useful, she had lost the distinction between usefulness and self-erasure. She had confused giving with disappearing. She had thought, without examining the thought, that she was only justified in taking up space if she was offering something in return. And so she had bent herself continuously toward that offering, and the bending had become habitual, and the habit had become invisible. And here she was, tired in a way that sleep could not touch, in a valley that had appeared without invitation, in an inn that tended everything that came through its door. She looked at the candle. The wick was still white. It had never known fire, but that was not why it had not been lit. It had not been lit because she had not been ready to acknowledge what lighting it would mean, that she knew what she had been carrying that she had set it down, and that she was choosing with some deliberateness to stand back up with less weight and walk forward. She looked at Corin. He looked back at her. "You know," he said, and it was not a question. The tilt of his head, that quiet certainty. "I think I do," she said. He reached into the pocket of his apron and produced the taper, the long, slim one he used to light the inn's candles. He set it on the table between them. He did not light it himself. He did not move toward it. He simply placed it there, as he had placed the key, as he had placed the clay dish. An offering made without pressure. A next step set before her and left entirely to her choosing. She picked up the taper. She held it for a moment, the length of a breath or several breaths. And then she leaned toward the fire and lit it from the main flame. And then she brought the taper's small flame to the wick of the gold candle and held it there until the wick caught. The gold candle lit. Its flame was different from the others in the inn, not in color, not in heat, but in quality. It had the same breathing character as the lantern in the stone room, that slow, tide-like rhythm. She watched it for a long moment. The flame burned straight and clear, not straining upward, but simply present, simply itself, as though it had always known it would be lit and had simply been waiting for the right evening. Corin looked at the flame with an expression she could not fully name, not pride, not satisfaction exactly, but something warmer than both, something like recognition, like seeing something he had always expected to see and finding the sight of it no less good for the expectation. He reached across the table and set the brass scissors beside the dish, as he always did, and then he stood. "Dinner in an hour," he said, which was what he always said, and the saying of it tonight felt important in a way it had not felt before. A small, ordinary thing returned to ordinary life, ordinary warmth, ordinary continuation. After he was gone, she sat with the lit candle for a long time. She did not cry. She had thought she might, but the feeling that came was quieter than crying. It was more like the feeling of stepping out of something you have been carrying so long you had stopped knowing it was there, and discovering that your hands were free, and that they knew exactly what to do with the freedom. She opened her notebook and wrote one sentence, just one, set at the top of a fresh page. She closed the notebook without reading it back. The gold candle burned beside her, patient and clear, and the fire spoke its low and satisfied language. And the inn held everything in its warm and ancient arms. And she was all right, and she was exactly where she needed to be. And soon the smell of dinner would reach her from the kitchen, and she would eat, and she would be grateful for all of it. Through the rain-blurred window, the lake had taken on a color just at the edge of visible. A faint, warm gold at its center, as though something beneath the surface had noticed the candle. She asked him that evening over dinner how he had come to tend the inn. She had not planned to ask. They had been eating in companionable quiet, as they most often did. There was bread tonight, dense and slightly sweet, and a soup of root vegetables that had the color of autumn and the taste of something slow cooked and deeply considered. She had been watching the way the firelight played across the surface of her bowl, and the question had come up from somewhere below her thoughts, fully formed, offered without strategy. Corin set his spoon down. He did not seem surprised by the question, and he did not seem particularly inclined to deflect it. He sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things, giving it the full weight of his attention before responding. "I came in autumn," he said, "the way most people come to a place they're meant to stay without entirely meaning to, following something I couldn't name, arriving somewhere that felt less like a choice and more like a recognition." She waited. "The inn was already here," he said. "It had been kept before me, and it will be kept after. What I contribute is the daily part." He looked at the candle on the table between them, the gold one she had lit that afternoon. "The tending," he said, "the maintenance of the warmth. Do you ever want to leave?" she asked, and she asked it gently, without leading him anywhere, wanting only the honest answer. He considered this seriously. "There are mornings," he said, "when I stand at the window and I feel the pull of the hill and the road and whatever is on the other side of it. I'm not without that feeling." He looked at the fire. "But then I walk through the corridor, and the growing room asks something of me, and the shelves need attending, and there's someone at the door, and the pull of the other thing doesn't disappear, but it becomes proportionate." He looked at her. "I don't think the wanting to leave is a problem to be solved. I think it's how I know I'm still alive in here. She found this deeply comforting, though she was not certain she could have explained why. They were quiet for a while. The fire settled. A log gave a soft, rich sound as it shifted. "Did you know," she asked, "when I came, did you know what I was carrying?" The slight tilt of the head. "Not specifically," he said, "but I could see the shape of the weight. The way a person moves when they have been bent a long time in one direction." She nodded. She understood this. She had begun to understand that this was, in some sense, Corin's particular skill. Not magic, not foresight, but the practiced observation of a person who had sat across from many kinds of tiredness and had learned to see each one clearly. Was it obvious? She asked, and she meant it as a simple question, without vanity or embarrassment. "Not obvious," he said, "but present." He paused. "You held yourself the way people hold themselves when they have been carrying something with both hands for a long time, slightly forward, slightly compressed. By the time I saw you walking up the lane, you were already beginning to set it down." She thought about the lane, the dew on the cobblestones, the hedgerows, the lantern above the door. She thought about the moment she had read the name on the lintel and felt something in her chest settle. "I think I knew this place was here before I found it," she said. He nodded, unsurprised. "Most people do," he said. "They don't always know what they know, but the road finds them when they're ready." They finished dinner, and she helped carry the bowls to the kitchen in the quiet, comfortable way of people who have been sharing space long enough to have settled into small shared habits. The kitchen was exactly what she would have predicted. Worn and well used, clean in a practical way, smelling of the soup's roots and the bread's crust and the particular dry warmth of a fire-heated space. Corin washed the bowls with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, fully, without distraction, one bowl at a time. She dried them. They worked in silence, and the silence was one of the warmest she had ever been inside. Before she went up to bed, she paused at the shelves and found the gold candle's counterpart among the rows. The tall, unlit candle with the circle and line notation on its tag. It was not in the same position she had last seen it. It had been moved to the front of its row, slightly forward from the others, and the tag was different. The old mark The open circle with a line through it was still there. But below it, in the same compact hand, Corin had added something. A small vertical line, clean and simple, added to the circle. She studied it. Open circle, crossed once, then once more a new mark, not a closed mark, but a mark that acknowledged a crossing. She thought about what it might mean and found that she did not need to fully decode it. It felt right in the way that things feel right when they have been witnessed and acknowledged, not resolved, but seen. She went up the east staircase, stepping over the third step on her way. The room was as she had left it. The quilt, the desk, the window. The lake below was dark, and the stars were out in their full, careful arrangement, and the moon was a day past full, slightly diminished, but still generous in its light. She opened her notebook. Read the single sentence she had written by the gold candle. She read it again. Then she closed the notebook, blew out her candle, and lay down in the familiar warmth of the quilt, and the inn settled around her, and she slept very quickly, and her sleep was long and still, and the morning, when it came, would bring something she had not expected. A sound very early before the light from somewhere beneath the inn. A note, low and whole, like a bell that had been waiting its whole existence to be rung. She did not ask him about the bell that day. She understood, without needing to reason through it, that the bell would explain itself when it was ready, or perhaps more accurately, that she would understand it when she was ready, and that pressing it into meaning before that moment would only produce something lesser than what the truth of it was. Corin had taught her this, not in words, but in example, the art of approaching a thing as it was, on its own terms, without rushing it. Instead, she spent the morning in the growing room. She had asked Corin over breakfast whether she might spend some time there. He had said yes, with his particular quality of unsurprise, as though he had been expecting the question, possibly for several days. He brought her a small clay pot, empty, and a scoop, and he set a bag of dark, rich soil on the table beside the pots, and he showed her, briefly and without ceremony, the particular manner in which he filled the pots, pressing the soil in rather than packing it, leaving the surface slightly uneven, the way natural soil is, to allow air through. Then he left her to it. She worked through the morning. She filled 7 pots. She was not hurried. She pressed the soil in carefully, the way he had shown her, and she arranged the filled pots on the lower shelf, the same shelf where the empty pot with the circle and line mark sat. She placed them alongside it, not replacing it, but giving it neighbors. The work was simple and physical and completely absorbing. There was a quality to working with soil that she had not encountered since childhood, when her grandmother had kept a kitchen garden and had sometimes let her help with the early season planting. The same dense mineral smell, the same cool and warm combination of the soil temperature, the same satisfaction of a small act completed well and put in its place. She was not a gardener. She did not have the knowledge or the vocabulary of it, but she understood the basic transaction. You prepare a space, and you tend it, and you give the thing in it what it needs, and then you wait. The waiting was not passive. The waiting was the longest, most patient part of the tending. She thought, working in the growing room, that this was perhaps what she was learning at Ashenford in. Not how to stop. She had never needed to learn how to stop. She had always known stopping was possible in theory. What she was learning was how to wait with what she had prepared, instead of immediately moving to prepare the next thing. How to sit with the filled pots and trust that they did not require her to do anything further right now. How to allow the interval between preparation and growth to be an interval, a real one, with its own texture and its own value, instead of a gap to be filled with more activity. After she had finished the pots, she sat on the small stool in the corner of the growing room and looked at the plants on the shelves. The silver-gray ones, with their cool, slightly dusty smell. The taller ones whose leaves were a dark, waxy green. Near the ceiling, a plant she had not noticed before, tucked into a high corner, with small round leaves and a trailing habit that had sent its tendrils along the edge of the shelf and down, the tips of them barely touching the shelf below, pale green and searching. She found it very moving without knowing exactly why. She thought about the things in herself that had been reaching with similar tendrils. Tentatively, slowly, toward warmth they were not certain was there. Corin brought her lunch in the growing room. More of the dense bread and a bowl of something turned out to be a cold grain salad with herbs from the shelves, dressed with something sharp and light. She ate it among the plants, on the stool, with the clay pot of prepared soil beside her. And she could smell the herbs both in the bowl and in the air around her. And the layering of those two things, the eaten and the breathed, was an experience of sensory completeness she had not felt in a very long time. After lunch, she walked out to the north wall. The late rose was still there, still opening, or still in the process of opening, in the way of a flower that takes its time. It had not hurried in the days since she first saw it, had not rushed to fullness. It was still partly furled, still turning by degrees toward whatever warmth it could find, patient in a way that now seemed to her not like effort, but like dignity. She sat on the ground near the outbuilding wall, her back against the stone, the sun on her face at the angle it took in the middle of the day when the sky was clear, and she closed her eyes. She could hear the wind in the vine above her, the small dry sound of the seed heads in the wild garden, a bird somewhere very close in the hedgerow, not the single note bird she had heard at the lake, but a different one, a more varied singer, its phrases short and exploratory as though it were improvising. She sat there for a long time. When she opened her eyes, a bee was visiting the rose, one single bee, unhurried and precise, working the partly open bloom with a thoroughness that was neither hasty nor slow. It was simply present to the flower and to the task, and the flower was present to the bee, and she was present to both of them, and the afternoon held all three of them in its long, comfortable light. She would find before dinner that the soil in the empty pot on the growing room shelf, the one with Corin's circle mark, had changed. Very small, breaking the surface at its center, the first pale curve of something beginning. She found herself the following morning thinking about leaving, not urgently, not unhappily. It arrived the way things arrive when they are natural and right, not as a decision forced upon her, but as a knowing that had matured in her while she wasn't watching. She became aware of it the way you become aware in winter that the light has been returning gradually, then suddenly, then obviously. She lay in bed and held it. The knowing was not loss. She had been afraid a little that it would feel like loss, the thought of leaving Ashenford Inn would carry the particular grief of departing something you love. And there was tenderness in it, yes. There was already something warm and aching in the prospect of the lane and the hedgerows behind her, and the chimney smoke above the roofline, and Corin's quiet, steady presence growing smaller as she walked. But it was not grief. It was more like the feeling of completing a sentence that has been building for a long time. The rightness of the period, the completion of the thought. She had come here with something too heavy to carry, and she had, slowly, in this candlelit place, set it down. Not all of it. She was not naive enough to imagine she had resolved everything that had led her down the winding road. But the worst of the weight, the most falsely held parts of it, were here on the floor of the inn now, where she had left them, and they did not need to come with her. She dressed and went downstairs. Corin was at the shelves. He looked at her as she came down, and she saw the recognition in his face, immediate, unhurried. And she knew that he had known, probably before she had, that today would be this kind of morning. "I'll leave tomorrow," she said. He nodded once, the slight tilt of acknowledgement rather than farewell. "I thought it might be soon," he said, without any particular register of sorrow. The gold candle has been burning very clearly. She looked at the shelves. The gold candle, her gold candle, the one she had lit, the one that corresponded to her room, was indeed burning differently than the others. Brighter, perhaps, or more precisely, not brighter, but more fully itself, the flame upright and clean, and without any of the slight flicker that the other candles always carried. "What does it mean when one burns like that?" she asked. "It means the work is done," he said. "Whatever the guest came here to do." She looked at it for a long time. "I don't feel done," she said. She meant this not as protest, but as honest report. "No," he agreed. "Done isn't the same as finished. Finished is the end. Done means you've received what you came for." He paused. "The rest of the work happens after. In the ordinary world, in the ordinary rooms, with the ordinary light." He looked at her steadily. "That part the inn can't do for you. Only you can do that part." She understood. They had breakfast, porridge again, the sweet dark preserves, the tea that was still as impossible to name, and as deeply comforting as on the first morning. She ate it with the same full attention she had developed here, giving the simple thing its full due. After breakfast, she went down to the candle room. She did not ring the bell. She stood before it for some time, feeling the residual hum of it in the air. She always felt it when she came down here, even when no sound was present, as though the bell's most recent note were still slowly completing itself. She understood the bell now, or enough of it. It was not a signal for anything. It was not a call or a warning or an announcement. It rang when something in the inn was ready, and the tone of it traveled up through the stone and into the sleeping person and woke them gently, drawing them down into the heart of the place to receive whatever was ready to be received. She had been rung. She had come. She had received. She walked among the candles of the room slowly, one last time. She was not sad exactly, but she was aware, very aware, of each specific flame, each particular breathing presence, the shared warmth of the whole as something she was moving through rather than simply being inside of. She wanted to remember it with precision, not as a general warmth, but as a specific place, specific flames, specific stones. She spent perhaps an hour in the room. When she came back upstairs, Corin was in the growing room. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a while, the usual quality of his attention, the same gentleness with each plant, the small adjustments made with careful hands. She saw him pause at the pot she had been watching, the one with the circle mark, the one with the pale new shoot. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached up to the shelf above and moved one of the silver-gray plants a few inches to the left, so that the new shoot in the pot below would receive slightly more of whatever diffuse light the room carried. Such a small adjustment, such specific care. She watched him and understood, not for the first time, but more deeply than before, that this was the thing she was bringing home with her. Not a resolution, not an answer, not even a new version of herself, fully formed and stable. She was bringing home the knowledge of this quality of attention, the willingness to make the small adjustment, the patience to wait for the small result, the understanding that what grows in slow warmth grows more fully than what grows under pressure. She would pack in the late afternoon. She would spend the last evening by the fire with Corin, and they would talk, and the night would come down around them in its slow and patient way, and the last candle of her room would burn quietly on the shelf, and she would sleep well and deeply. And in the morning, the valley would be full of mist, and the road would be waiting. She heard the sound before she was fully awake, and so it became part of waking, woven into the slow rise from sleep the way sound sometimes is, present before she could have said with certainty whether she was in a dream or in the room. A single low note, rounded and deep, without sharpness. It did not repeat. It simply was, and then it faded, and the fading took a long time, as though the note had been very large and the room it was fading into was very small. She lay still for a moment. The sky outside the window was that particular dark blue of very early morning, not night, not quite dawn, the hour that exists in between and belongs to neither. Stars still visible, but the black edge had gone out of them, and they were pale and receding. The lake below was a faint silver smear in the valley, still and flat. She got up. She dressed slowly in the pre-dawn, by touch, and by the faint silver light through the window. Her boots, her coat over the shirt. She took the brass key from the desk where she had left it, not because she knew where it would take her, but because it seemed, this morning, like the thing to have in her hand. Downstairs, the inn was as still as she had ever seen it. The fire had burned low to a deep bed of coals, orange red and even, giving off heat without light, and the room's candles had all burned down in the night. So the only illumination was the glow from the coals and the faint early light entering through the windows. The inn in this light was beautiful in a different way than it was in the warmth of evening, more austere, more ancient. The stone walls and heavy beams appearing without the softening of amber candlelight, and she could see in the bones of the building how old it really was, how many seasons had pressed against these walls, how many people had moved through this room, carrying how many different weights. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment and felt all of that history as something gentle, not heavy, not haunting, but accumulated, the way warmth is accumulated in a stone after a long day of sun. The sound had come from below. She had not known there was a below. She found the the door at the far end of the corridor, past the growing room, past the room with the lantern. In a section of the corridor she had not yet reached. The door was stone, not wood set in stone, but a door made entirely of stone, fitted so precisely into the wall that in the low light she might have walked past it, except that along its base, from the gap between door and floor, a glow was coming. The same breathing, golden and pale silver light she had seen from the lantern room, but more of it deeper, as though the lantern below was very large, or the light was coming from many lanterns at once. She looked at the brass key. There was a keyhole in the stone door, small, precisely made, the same warm brass as the key. She put the key in. It turned without resistance, with a sound like a very soft sigh. The door opened onto a staircase, descending into warmth. The stairs were stone, worn to smooth curves in their centers, and the walls on either side were close enough that she could touch both with her hands, which she did, feeling the stone cool and slightly damp and fundamental under her fingers. The staircase curved once gently and then opened below into a room. The room was large. She had not expected it to be large. From what she understood of the inn's foundations, she had expected something small, a root cellar, a storage space. But this was a proper room, taller than the corridor above, with stone arches supporting the ceiling, and in the arches and along the walls and on freestanding iron stands in the center of the space candles, hundreds of them, all lit, all breathing. She stood on the last stair and looked. The light in the room was extraordinary. It was amber and silver and gold all at once, layered and moving in the way of many candles burning in proximity, each flame adding its particular breath to the shared atmosphere, the whole effect being something more than the sum of the parts, a warm, living, textured light that felt less like illumination than like presence, as though the room itself were awake and aware. At the far end, against the deepest wall, was the source of the sound she had heard. It was a bell, a large one, iron dark and old, suspended from a stone bracket at chest height, and its clapper was still barely moving, swaying fractionally on its mounting, the motion almost invisible, but the residual vibration still present in the air, which explained the long fading of the note she had heard. She walked across the room toward the bell between the candles, and she could feel their warmth as she passed each one, wave after wave of it, layered and kind. She stopped before the bell. It was old, very old, older than the inn by the look of it, its iron surface mottled and textured with long exposure to air. Around its base, worn almost to illegibility by time, a line of text had been cut into the iron in letters she could not read. She did not need to read them. She stood before the bell, and the bell stood before her, and the room held its hundreds of small flames in patient attendance, and she understood, without being told, that this was the heart of the inn, not the fire in the grate, not the growing room, not the lantern, this room, this bell, this quiet accumulation of light. She had been brought here by a sound in the night. She would find Corin standing at the top of the stairs when she turned to go, the taper in his hand, watching her with the expression she now knew well, the small tilt, the deep and patient warmth. And he would say nothing at all, and that would be exactly right. She woke on the last morning to mist. It had come in overnight, filling the valley from the lake upward, so that when she looked out the window above the desk, she could see only the nearest meadow and the first low suggestion of a hill before the world dissolved into white. The lake was gone. The far hills were gone. Even the hedgerows at the edge of the inn's grounds were only shapes, soft and doubled, floating in the gray. She had expected to feel the strangeness of it, the mist, the departure, the particular quality of a last morning. But what she felt instead was a kind of spaciousness. The mist was not obscuring the world. It was simplifying it. It was giving her only what was close and real and immediately present, which turned out to be the warm room, the quilt, the desk, the small high window, the sound of the inn beneath her settling in its quiet, centuries-old way. She dressed. She packed her bag, the change of clothes, the notebook, heavier now than when she had carried it in, full of the small observations and the 7 nighttime pages and the single sentence she had written by the gold candle, which she had not yet reread and did not intend to reread until she was back in ordinary life and ready to let it mean what it meant. She left the room exactly as she had found it, except for one thing: the candle on the desk which had burned companionably through her many evenings here. She left with a small new wick trim, the brass scissors she had borrowed from the table downstairs at some point during the week, without planning to borrow them. She had trimmed the wick the way she had watched Corin do it, a small, precise cut, an act of care extended to something that had no ability to ask for it, a habit of attention. She set the scissors on the windowsill and left the room. Downstairs, the fire was at its full warmth. The inn was as she had always known it. The flagstone, the beams, the tables, the clay dishes, the shelves with their rows of candles. Her gold candle was still lit, but as she came down the stairs, she saw its flame do something she had not seen before. It bent, not in a draught, but of itself, as though bowing, and then it straightened, and then it went out. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the extinguished wick. The wax was still warm. The thin thread of smoke rose from it, pale and brief. Corin appeared from the kitchen. He looked at the candle for a moment and then at her, and in his expression there was something she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen and not been able to name, which was a quiet and genuine tenderness, the kind that does not ask anything in return. They had breakfast. She did not remember afterward what they talked about, not because it was forgettable, but because it was the kind of conversation that exists entirely in its own moment, that does not make itself available to summary or recollection, because it was not made of information, but of presence. She remembered the quality of it, unhurried, warm, honest, without heaviness. She remembered the way Corin held his teacup. She remembered that at one point she laughed at something, and that it was a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprises you. When it was time, she stood at the front door with her bag over her shoulder. Corin stood in the middle of the room, not the doorway. He did not follow guests to the threshold, she thought. For the same reason he did not watch the road when they had gone, because the work of departure belonged to the one departing, not the one remaining, and he understood that boundary. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then he reached into the pocket of his linen apron and produced something she had not expected. A small candle, cream-colored, simply made, not lit. He held it out. She took it. "For the first night," he said, "when you're back," she understood. Not a gift of magic, not a piece of the inn's mystery carried out with her in a jar, just a candle, a practical thing, a small instruction. On the first night back in ordinary life, light this and sit with it and give the day its due, and let the space around you be warm. She closed her hand around it. She went out the door. The lane was damp and quiet, the cobblestones dark with mist, the hedgerows on either side reduced to soft presences on either side of her path. She walked the lane without looking back until she had reached the point where it curved, and the inn would be visible one last time through the gap in the hedgerow. She stopped. Through the gap, the inn held in the mist, its windows still warm within a light, the chimney still releasing its patient thread of smoke. She could not see Corin, but she could feel the quality of the building, its settled warmth, its ancient patience, its absolute indifference to urgency. It existed at a remove from the press of time, and it would go on existing there when she was long past the memory of the valley and the road. But she would not be past the memory. She knew this. She would carry it, the candlelight, the growing room, the bell's single note in the dark, the late rose still opening, the brass scissors set down with care, the unlit candle, and then the lit one, and the quality of the light they gave. She turned and walked into the mist, and the mist received her, and the road appeared beneath her feet one step at a time, and the hills above her were beginning, just beginning, to come back through the white. She was tired in the right way for once. She was exactly herself, and the morning was soft, and there was a road beneath her, and she walked.